So we all know major chords sound happy, minor chords sound sad, but there are more emotions than just happy or sad. With that in mind, let's talk seventh chords. Seventh chords add a new level of color, more nuanced emotion, and complexity to your songs. But what makes a seventh chord, and how can we use them strategically in our music? Let's find out. So what exactly is a seventh chord? Well, if we lay out the notes of a scale or a chord, the seventh note is what we're looking for. So once we find it, now we just add this note to the chord. So let's take a look at the good old C major scale. Now we have our corresponding degrees that go along with those notes in that scale. We have our root, we have our major third, we have our fifth. Now we're looking for the seventh. Now in this case, which one is a seventh? Well, that's the B note. So to create a seventh chord off of the root note, we're actually going to use the 1, we're going to use the major third, we're going to do the fifth, and now we add that seventh, and those four notes together create the C major 7 chord. So now that we see what notes compose the C major 7, we're going to see what it looks like on guitar tab, on a fretboard diagram, and now we're going to hear what it sounds like. So what we're going to be doing is hearing the major chords and the major 7th chords back to back and see what they sound like. Now as you hear the major chords and their major 7th counterparts, listen to how they compare emotionally. Now I'm also going to be playing some variations of these chords because just like we can play major chords in different spots on the fretboard, we could also do the same thing with our major 7th chords. Now learning the major 7th chords in different spots can give us different artistic choice alternatives depending on the sound that we're looking for. And here's an example of that. Here's a good old open C major, we all know this one. And we're going to play the C major 7. Now here's a variation of the C major 7 barring the 3rd fret. Barring it at the 3rd fret gives us an extra G note at the bottom. Now here's another variation. Now this is one of my favorite ways to play a major 7 chord. And as you can see, it's a staggered kind of a shape. Again, C major 7. The C major 7 has all the same notes, just in a different position. Now I might choose one of these three depending on how I want the progression to sound. Maybe I want this particular C major 7 to speak a little higher in pitch. So what I'm going to do is go over there. Now if I want to sound a little bit more open, a little bit more airy, what I'm going to do is play it down here, play a C major 7 open position. Now just know that there are more variations of the C major 7 chord along the neck. I just showed you 3 versions, and there are more, but these 3 will get you started. So now I'm going to play a G major chord against a G major 7 chord, and we're going to see what that feels like. Hear the difference? Again, here's another G major variation. Now here's a 5th fret version. Again, as you go up the neck, you hear the different voicings. You might want to choose one of these depending on what you want to bring out. This chord can convey feelings of romanticism, serenity, smoothness, intimacy, a dreamy or introspective and reflective quality, and a relaxed sound. You know, you probably hear it in ballads, maybe some soulful jazz, and contemplative music. Pro tip. Play a major 7th chord right after a minor chord, and the major 7th chord can take on a more happier feel in contrast. But if you were to play a G major and then a G major 7 right after that, well, the G major 7 might take on a more pensive and introspective feel, much like a minor chord would. So keep this in mind when writing chord progressions. But learning 7ths doesn't stop with the major 7. There are 4 main types of 7th chords. Now each one will have its own unique flavor. For example, the major 7, which we just learned, then we have the dominant 7, then we have the minor 7, and we have the diminished 7. Now I'm going to show you how each one of these can be used in any given key. But first, let's see what the dominant 7 sounds like. Now the dominant 7 sounds really strong and pretty tense. It makes the listener want to hear that tonic or that root chord again. So a dominant 7 is composed of the 1, the 5, the 3, and a 7th note, but the 7th note is not a major 7th anymore. It is actually a half step down from there. So instead of being C, E, G, B, it would be C, E, G, B flat. And depending on the context, this chord could sound really bluesy and have some serious attitude, or it could just be a really nice setup to going back to that root chord. Now you've probably heard the word dominant thrown around in music theory. Now in music theory, dominant refers to the 5th note or the 5th degree in the scale. So the dominant is often thought of as the most important note after the root note or the home bass. So our 7th chord is often referred to as the dominant 7th chord because it's built around the 5th note of the scale. So if you remember our Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, in our C major scale, for example, the 1 is C. Our dominant chord, or the V chord, is G. So in the key of C major, if we actually played a G7, or otherwise known as the G dominant 7, we'll be playing a 7th chord that actually fits in key. So talking about dominant 7ths, the dominant note or chord feels tense, like it wants to return to the tonic or the home bass to feel complete and resolved. So it's a way of making music feel like it's going somewhere and that the story's moving along. Or maybe you want to break the rules and leave it as your cliffhanger for your song. Play a dominant 7th chord at the end. So again, the dominant 7 is the root note, the major 3rd, the 5th, otherwise known as the perfect 5th, and the minor 7th. But just know that this chord is not to be confused with the minor 7 chord. This chord is a little bit different. It sounds a little sad, a little jazzy at the same time. Now this chord consists of the root, the 5th, the minor 3rd, and the minor 7. So to me, to my ears, it doesn't sound quite as serious and quite as sad and gloomy as its minor triad counterpart. To me, it sounds a little more sophisticated, quietly assertive, and like it has something on its mind. Now moving on to the diminished 7th chord. Think of these as your wild card. You hold them in your back pocket for when the time is right, and you can use them strategically. It's a diminished 7th chord with an extra flat note. So it can literally be written as C, E flat, G flat, and B flat flat. Okay? But really that just means that it's another half step down from the minor 7 note and a whole step down from the major 7 note. Technically, diminished 7s don't really fit into a major or relative minor scale, but that doesn't mean that they aren't useful. They can be used right after a chord as a springboard or a passing chord to your next chord. Now don't worry, we'll explore examples of how they can be used a little bit later. So how do you actually use all of these 7th chords in music? Well, first we actually need to know how 7th chords can fit diatonically into a key or a scale. Now the word diatonic is just a fancy way of saying you're only playing the notes in the scale or key. You're not actually deviating from those notes. So whether you're playing chords or melodies, the diatonic notes means you're not coloring outside the lines. So diatonically, what are the 7th chords and its variations that fit in the key, for example, of C? So here's a trick. We take all the notes of the major scale and we put them in line, in this case the key of C. Now here it is, starting with one note that you want the chord to be built around. So let's say we want to play the 1. We want to use the 1 chord and make a 7th chord that fits diatonically using that root note. So what we do is we take the root note and then we pick every other note for a total of 4 notes, and boom, there's your 7th chord key in that scale diatonically. So C major 7 becomes C, E, G, B. D minor 7 becomes D, F, A, C. E minor 7 becomes E, G, B, D. F major 7 becomes F, A, C, E. G7 becomes G, B, D, F. A minor 7 becomes A, C, E, G. So because we know that B diminished 7 actually doesn't fit into any key and we're trying to fit diatonically this time around, we're actually going to play only B, D, F, and A. So those chords again are D major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G dominant 7 or G7, A minor 7, and B diminished. These are the 7th chords and its variations that fit diatonically in scale in the C major scale. Now as you can see, this little trick can be used with any major key. So just take every other note starting with the 1 note that you want to be built around. Those next 4 notes, every other note, is a 7th chord that will fit in key. But what if you're in a minor key, like say E minor? Well, it's really the same process. Just lay out the notes in the E minor, which again is G major because it's the relative major, and use the same approach. There you go. There are all your 7th chords in that key. So here's a rule of thumb on how to choose your 7th chords and why you'd want to choose them. So use major 7 chords to add color and emotion to ground major chords and cheer up minor chords. So these can add introspection and a dreamy vibe. Use dominant 7th chords to add tension or movement and a little attitude and flair. And you might want to plan to resolve them on more stable chords, usually the tonic or another target chord. Now because the dominant 7th chords are built around the V chord or the 5 chord, you can easily play something like the 1, 5, 4, but make that 5 a dominant 7th. And there you go, it's going to sound great. Alright, now how do you use minor 7th chords? Well, use minor 7th chords when you want a minor sound that's not too sad. So it's a little smoother, softer, and more sophisticated than a plain minor chord, and it's perfect for emotional, jazzy, or laid-back vibes, and they're perfect for funk music. So what about diminished 7th chords? Well, as we heard, they're unstable by nature, and they really don't fit into any major or minor scale, so how can we use them? Well, let's take a look at the fretboard and see an example. So you see how we have spaces in between the notes of our fretboard when we play a major key? Now these can be used as passing notes, sometimes played briefly between 2 chords. For example, the C and the D, we have a space. We can play the middle note, C sharp or D flat, and use that as a passing tone. So when we have chords that we're playing that have a space in between, a little open space, we can actually insert a diminished 7th chord based on that note, and that's going to be our passing chord to get to the next chord. Now this usually works best when we're going from that 1 chord to the next chord. Use that middle note as the base of our diminished chord. For example, between a C and a D as a space, we can actually insert a C sharp diminished chord as a passing chord to get to that D chord. Or between the G and the A, we actually do a G sharp diminished to get to that A chord. So all we need to do now is learn some of the chord shapes so that we can use them. I highly recommend learning at least one of these shapes. Learn all three if you can. But these can be played anywhere up and down the neck. All we need to do is know what we're playing, and we can choose the right one. Now the first diminished shape looks like this. It starts on the low E string. Now just for the fun of it, we can give these chords names based on what they remind us of. We can call this one the Friends in Low Places chord. If you know, you know. All right, now here's the second shape. Now we can call this one the Eagle Claw.
Ooh!
And the third shape we're going to learn today is more of a stagger. So we call this one the Stagger. And it starts on the third string down on the D string, and you can use it, again, anywhere up the neck. Probably the easiest one to play for me. So now we're going to play a C major 7 and a D minor 7. We know that these are diatonic chords of the C major key. But now we're going to use a diminished 7 as a passing chord between them. Now because we want to pass between the C and the D, we're going to do a C sharp. So we want to find a diminished chord with the C sharp in it. So where is that? Well, here's something crazy you probably didn't know, and it makes it really easy to find. Well, because of the nature of the chord, any note of a diminished 7 chord can be the root. This means we can choose a diminished chord that's the closest or the easiest to play so long as it contains that note we're trying to find as passing chord. In this case, the C sharp. We want that to be one of the notes. So that's right, any note of a diminished chord can be the root note. So let's give that a try. All right, now let's try putting it between the G and the A. We'll do something like a G major and an A minor. All right, so let's put a G sharp diminished in between the G and the A minor. So really, instead of being restricting, the diminished 7th chord is actually very versatile. Honestly, we can make an entire video on it, and that's actually what I did right here. Just go ahead and click it. Go ahead. Right there.